Morning, Year 10. Welcome to Week 5, Term 5's lesson on the homework that you've been asked to submit this week. This week, as you'll see from the learning question, we're looking at the 16-mark question in the medicine paper. So that is the question at the end of your medicine paper, with the most marks in the whole paper. A quick look at the question. We'll talk through that, and then we'll go through some of the information that you need in order to answer the question. As always, make sure you've got pen and paper handy, and ideally the question printed out in front of you. If not, you can pause this video at any point just to make sure you've got this question, so that you can have a go at writing it subsequently. So, the question, as on your sheets, is: has religion been the main factor in the development of medicine in Britain since medieval times? Explain your answer with reference to religion and other factors. Use a range of examples from across your study of the health and the people, from c. 1000, which means the year 1000 AD, to the present day. So we're looking at the last 1,000 years of history. We're looking at a range of examples from across those periods. So ideally, to get top marks in this question, you need to be giving examples from 1000 AD to the present day. It needs a range of examples, including medieval, Renaissance, early modern, and modern, ideally. This question is asking you about religion as a factor, so we will definitely have to talk about that. It's also asking you about medicine as a factor, so that should control or decide some of the examples that we're going to use. We won't be using examples of surgery or medicine or public health in our answer to this question, and that's something that I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. In terms of what this question is actually asking you, getting rid of all the extra words and the details that the examiners add to questions, I've tried to rewrite it out below. I would say, was religion the most important factor in the development of medicine through history, or was another factor more important? This is really asking you to come to a judgment. So overall, how can you explain whether another factor was more important or whether religion was the most important? Remember also with this question, looking at the marks, you've got 16 marks for the actual question and then 4 marks for spelling and grammar. So make sure you're using punctuation, paragraphs, capital letters in the right places, and full stops where you need to as well, to make sure you're getting those nice and easy punctuation, spelling and grammar marks. So in this session, we're going to, hopefully you've got a good understanding of the meaning of the question now. Following that, we're going to have a look at the individuals or events that are important to the course, and we're going to categorize them. So we're going to think about whether they're examples of medicine, public health, or surgery. Then we're going to recall some of those key events. I'm going to talk to you about them in a bit more detail, and then just very, very briefly this time, because it is a longer homework, I will go over some of the details on the 16-mark question. So for the individuals that you've got on your sheet, now you might want to pause this video now and go through this on yourself, but just so we're clear, medicine, your examples from the sheet are Hippocrates, Galen. Surgery, John of Ardenne. Another medicine one, Ibn Sina. Vesalius, Paré. William Harvey, John Hunter for surgery. Edward Jenner for medicine. Chadwick for public health. Snow for public health. Pasteur. You'll notice I put Louis Pasteur in all 3. I'll explain why that is when we talk about him in a bit more detail. James Simpson, Joseph Lister, Robert Koch, Fleming, Florian Chain, and Bevan. So these are by no means all of the people that you need to know about or all of the events that you need to know about in the medicine course, but they are a good number of examples that you can use in your answers. If you want to pause this screen now and check what you wrote against this screen, that's absolutely fine. I'm now going to tell you about these 18 individuals in a bit more detail, just to remind yourselves. So we're going to split the explanations into medicine, surgery, and public health. Starting off with medicine, starting in ancient Greece, we're looking at Hippocrates. And Hippocrates was a doctor who developed the 4 humours theory. So that was the idea that the body was split into 4 humours or 4 different liquids, and that if they weren't balanced, that would make you ill. In addition to that theory, he also developed the Hippocratic Oath, which is still sworn by doctors today and means that doctors have to swear to try and keep their patients safe at all times. He developed the idea of clinical observation, watching a patient to see what was wrong with them. Again, that is still a technique that's used today. The recording of symptoms, another technique that's still used today, writing down what you thought was wrong with someone to get an idea of what might be making them ill. And he wrote these ideas down in the Hippocratic Corpus, which was a set of 10 books that were used by other people following his death to understand the discoveries that he made about medicine. On the picture there on the right, you've also got a nice diagram just showing us how Hippocrates thought the body was divided into 4 different sections. Following on from Hippocrates, in ancient Greece, the greatest thinker of ancient Roman medicine was a man called Galen. He was operating at the turn of the century in about 0 to 50 AD. Lots of his work was based on the dissection of animals to draw images of anatomy. So he used to cut open animals like pigs and rats. He couldn't cut open humans because Christians thought that was going against God. So he'd cut open animals, do detailed drawings of their insides to get a better understanding of what the inside of the human body looked like. Very famously conducted a number of experiments on pigs to show how nerves moved messages from the brain to different parts of the body by testing if he cut a certain part of the nerve, why would the pig squeal or which part of the pig's body would move. In addition to that, he developed Hippocrates' ideas. So he saw the 4 humours theory and developed his own opposites theory. So that was the idea that if you had an imbalance in the 4 humours, say you didn't have enough blood, you could balance it by potentially drinking something or taking something. And that's a big development in medicine because it's some of the first thinking around taking medicines to make yourself better. So the idea that something can be added to the body that will improve the condition of the patient. Now, he might have not always been correct about what he wanted to add, but it was a start in terms of thinking of what are the things that we can give patients to make them better. Moving out of the ancient period and towards the medieval period, and also moving to the east, so in what is now modern day Iraq, there was a thinker, the most famous thinker of their time was a man called Ibn Sina. He was a philosopher, a doctor, a scientist, had lots of different skills, and was particularly interested in curing illness. So he believed, as lots of Muslims did at the time, Allah had sent a cure for every illness. So their God, within their religion, had sent a cure to make people better from every illness. And thinking about this, Ibn Sina produced the Canon of Medicine, which wasn't one book, it was a collection of many books that contained 760 drugs and remedies to improve the health of patients. So he looked at illnesses and he tried to, working through the body from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet, explain different drugs or remedies that could be given to people to make them better. This book was really, really important in the Middle East, in modern day Iraq, but also managed to reach Europe as a result of the Crusades. So in the 12th century and the 11th century, lots of soldiers from Britain and England went to the Middle East to fight against Muslims in religious wars. And as they did that, they brought the ideas of Ibn Sina back in terms of treatment. And this meant that his book was used in European universities until about the 17th century. There's still some remedies that are relevant today. So jumping ahead, still thinking about medicine, but now we're into the early modern period. So you'll notice with these names, I'm jumping through hundreds and hundreds of years between them. That doesn't mean there wasn't any advance in medicine. It just means that these are the key individuals that we're focused on. So next, in the 18th century, a period that we call the early modern period, was Edward Jenner. He was trained by a man called John Hunter, who we'll look at later, and discovered a vaccination for smallpox. So in the 18th century and in the several hundred years before the 18th century, a disease called smallpox had caused massive amounts of deaths around the world, but particularly in South America and in Britain. Smallpox is a horrible disease. It kills about 30% of the people that it infected, and those that survived could often suffer horrible skin conditions and also blindness. So Edward Jenner saw this and wanted to make a change or have an effect on it. Now, before Edward Jenner's work, patients would have something called inoculation, which is where a doctor would give them a small amount of smallpox, infect them with a small amount of smallpox. They would get ill, and then hopefully they'd recover from that infection, and they would then be immune to smallpox. Their body would have worked out how to fight it off, and so they wouldn't be at risk of getting it again. However, very often people would either couldn't afford the inoculation, it was a very expensive process, or they would get ill and not recover. So they might die from the inoculation. The illness would be too strong for them, and so they wouldn't recover. So Jenner, noticing this, wanted to make a change and wanted to effect a change. And he noticed, particularly in milkmaids, that they would not get smallpox. They had very good skin. That was because they very rarely suffered from smallpox. And he realized it was because they'd already had a disease called cowpox. And that cowpox, having had cowpox, would allow people's bodies to build up the immunity to smallpox. So he discovered and developed this vaccine, the word vaccine coming from the Latin for cow, which is vacca. He developed this vaccine, giving people cowpox to prevent them from getting smallpox. And this was really, really successful. He first did it on a small child in 1798. And because of its success, in the turn of the century, in the 1800s, he was given £30,000 by the then government to open a vaccination clinic. Following on from this, in 1852, the government made it the law that all people should be vaccinated against smallpox in England. And even further on from that, in the 1980s, smallpox was one of the first massive diseases to pretty much be eradicated from the world. So we don't see people dying as a result of smallpox, and that is a direct result of the work and research of Edward Jenner. When we're thinking about factors with Edward Jenner, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on, in terms of a factor, he's a very good example of a brilliant individual because he worked on his own. He worked against doctors who didn't want to accept his work because they were already making a lot of money from inoculation. He was also from Somerset, he was from the countryside. So lots of the London doctors were very dismissive of his research. So he's a very, very good example of one person who made an enormous change to medicine. Following on from Jenner and looking at a scientist based in France now, Louis Pasteur is probably the most important person in the development of medicine in the whole of the course that we studied. His germ theory in 1861 proved that germs are in the air all around us. That was a very, very significant discovery because it disproved spontaneous generation, the idea that illness would just burst out of something, people would just become ill. It was very, very important because it meant that people following on from Pasteur knew that they had to deal with germs in order to prevent people getting ill or in order to make people better. And we'll look at why that's important later on. A couple of the things that you might remember about Louis Pasteur that we'd studied in class already. He also developed the process of pasteurization, which is boiling a liquid to kill the bacteria in it. And he proved his germ theory by using the Swan-Next flask experiment. So that was a special flask that he designed that looks fairly similar to the one down here. It had a curved neck, and then he had one flask where he broke the top of the flask off, and he had one where it had a whole curved neck. And what he discovered was, in the flask where he'd broken the curved neck off, more bacteria was able to get to the liquid in the bottom and it went off quicker, thus proving that germs are in the air all around us. At a similar time to Pasteur, there was a German scientist called Robert Koch working. They were competing against each other because there was a conflict going on called the Franco-Prussian War. And both men's countries wanted to fund their research so that they could make quick discoveries on germs so that they could be more successful within the war. Koch discovered, using Pasteur's research, he said, right, you've identified there's a germ, but you haven't identified specific germs. So he discovered a technique using Petri dishes. The Petri dish was something that was designed by one of his assistants to stain different bacteria so that he could identify the different bacteria that were causing anthrax, TB, and cholera. This is really, really crucial because that allowed scientists to begin to start to identify what drugs or treatments they could use to kill those bacteria. So it was the start of people inventing vaccines for these sort of illnesses. Building on Koch's work, Koch, again, very good example of teamwork as a factor, just because he worked in a large team, as did Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur suffered a stroke quite young in his life, and so needed to work as part of a team in order to have the physical assistance in order to do the research that he wanted to. Following on from Koch, Alexander Fleming also used similar techniques to Koch. So he was a Scottish doctor who was very interested in flu due to a flu pandemic in 1918 that killed about 50 million people around the world. He was researching the bacteria that caused the flu pandemic using these Petri dishes when he accidentally made the discovery that would save millions and millions and millions of lives in World War II. And that discovery was that there was a mold. He left a Petri dish by the window when he went on holiday, and a mold flew through the window, flew into the Petri dish, and killed the bacteria in the Petri dish. So he discovered that there was a mold that could kill bacteria. He didn't try it on humans. He didn't really go much further with his experiments, but it was a very important step to working out how to prevent bacteria within the human body, and thus germs and bacteria, same thing, causing infection. The two men, and again, this is a nice example of teamwork, the two men that used Alexander Fleming's work and applied it to humans were Florey and Chain. So they were two scientists who worked together at Oxford University. They built on the work of Alexander Fleming and discovered penicillin worked on people. They actually tested it on a policeman called Alexander Armstrong, who'd had a cut on his lip from a rose. They managed to stop the infection from spreading briefly. They didn't have enough penicillin, so eventually he died. But what they proved was if you gave penicillin to people, you could stop infections and therefore prevent a lot of deaths. As a result of their work, they were funded they were given £25, which is about £5,000 in today's money, by the British wartime government to further their research on the mass production of penicillin. How can we make enough penicillin to save millions and millions of troops in World War II? And they were very successful with that production at Oxford University, and eventually led to the production of about 2.4 million doses of penicillin, which was given to different people during the war, and lots of people say was a very, very important reason for the Allies winning World War II. So those are our key characters within medicine. As I said, they're not everybody that you need to know, but they should be a good amount of examples for our question, because if you remember, our question is focused on medicine. So you're going to be able to use these examples in your answer. Following on from medicine, we're going to look at surgery. So the first and most famous surgeon of the medieval times was a man called John of Ardern. He was one of the first people to start encouraging surgeons to be more scientific in their approaches, to write down their ideas, to train in a bit more detail, to share different practices that they were using. He was particularly famous for an operation that he designed to remove anal fistula, which are these nasty boils that knights would get on their bottoms from riding around on horses all day. He also, very significantly, formed the Guild of Surgeons. So that was a group of surgeons who worked together to improve their practices and make sure that they were respected as a profession. Because previously to John of Ardern, as you probably remember from class, most surgeons were barbers who had the equipment from their practice as barbers, but weren't really skilled in the same way as John of Ardern. Following on from Ardern, and we're now moving towards the Renaissance period, so John of Ardern would be your example for the medieval period, we have Vesalius, who was a very, very important contributor to the development of surgery. And again, a really nice example of individual brilliance because he challenged the accepted view. He challenged what most people thought was correct based on Galen. So he was a Flemish dwarf from Belgium who was very interested in the human anatomy, so what humans look like on the inside of their bodies. He used the bodies of dead criminals to carry out detailed illustrations of anatomy, and you'll see one of his illustrations on the right-hand side here. In 1543, Vesalius published his book on the fabric of the human body that contained detailed illustrations of the human body. So this was his most famous work, which he based on very careful dissections of dead criminals that he'd cut open and done very detailed drawings of. And it was a real development in the understanding of the human body because previously most dissections had been carried out on animals. It was seen as not a good thing to dissect human beings. So by doing that and using that, he managed to disprove a lot of Galen's ideas about the human body, I think about 200. Following on from Vesalius, our second Renaissance surgeon is Paré, Ambroise Paré. Ambroise Paré was a very good example of war as a factor in the development of surgery because he was a wartime surgeon. So lots of the problems that he sought to fix and the suffering that he saw in war, he tried to improve with his surgical practices. So the picture behind here, you'll see, is Ambroise Paré doing an amputation on the battlefield. So in battle at this time, muskets were used very widely. Cannon was used very widely as well. So when people would be hit with a musket or a cannon, often they would get an infection. And if the infection spread into the bloodstream, it could cause gangrene and cause the person to die. So very regularly, surgeons on the battlefield would perform amputations. And Paré, when he was carrying these out, was horrified by the suffering of his patients. So he developed a number of different ways of preventing it. Those included the crow's beak needle, which you'll see here. He's using to pull veins out of an amputated limb in order that he can tie them up to prevent blood loss. So that leads to the second thing that he developed, which was ligatures. They were tiny bits of silk that were tied around veins to prevent people who were having amputations bleeding out. In addition to this, he developed an ointment, which was a treatment for those people that had massive wounds on them. If he put the ointment on the wound, he'd prevent himself from having to use cauterizing oil, which was boiling oil that surgeons had previously used to burn wounds shut. And then finally, something that he also worked very hard on to improve the lives of soldiers after their amputations was prosthetic limbs. So they were fake arms, fake legs, fake hands in order to allow the patient to go back to their daily life with a bit more success than they had previously. Staying in the Renaissance and still focused on surgery, the next individual that we looked at was William Harvey. He was educated at Cambridge and Padua University, which is the same university that Vesalius was educated at, and he discovered through his research that blood was only pumped one way around the body by the heart. Previously, based on his dissections of animals and some pretty dodgy guesswork, Galen had said that blood was produced in the liver, and that the liver was like a fire, and it needed energy from food in order to produce more blood. William Harvey, through scientific methods and practices, including putting rods up the veins and pushing water through veins, proved that actually it was the case that blood was pumped around the body by the heart. And moreover, that it moves one way around the body. So it's pumped through the heart and it moves one way through the veins, so that the heart can pump oxygenated blood to the limbs and carry back deoxygenated blood. On his research, he wrote a book called De Mortu Cordis, where he shared his ideas. As with most of these men, some people challenged his ideas initially. He was challenging Galen, who was obviously supported by the church, and so many people labelled him a circulator, and didn't accept his ideas immediately. However, if we look at his work now, what his work allows us to do is things like blood transplants. If we didn't know that the heart pumped blood around the body, we wouldn't be able to do blood transplants, or do some of the very complicated heart surgery that now goes on. Again, staying in the Renaissance, and our final surgical thinker from the Renaissance, as you're probably noticing, the Renaissance was a very important time for the development of surgery, was a man called John Hunter. And he, similarly to John of Ardern in medieval times, really developed surgery as a profession. So he taught lots of people at the Royal College of Surgeons, which was in London. It's a very famous institution for training surgeons, including Edward Jenner, who we looked at earlier. He promoted the use of scientific methods, testing diseases on himself. As you probably remember from lessons in class, he gave himself syphilis and gonorrhea to test whether they were the same illness, whether they were caused by the same thing. He actually discovered they weren't, and then took 3 years trying to get rid of both STIs. But the importance of that example was that he was using experiments to make discoveries. He wasn't just accepting what he was being told. As well as that, he collected 3,000 specimens. So he had a 3,000 specimen collection that he kept, is now kept in a museum in London, called the Hunterian Collection. Within that collection, he included the bones of Charles Byrne, the Irish giant, and a number of different medical experiments and parts of people that he'd seen that he wanted to share with other trainee surgeons. So by documenting the things that he'd seen and preserving them, if you look at the collection, there's lots of body parts and fetuses and different things. He could teach people about what he'd already learned. And in doing this, he wrote down many of his ideas for teaching. Staying in surgery, but now moving on to the early modern period, a major problem within surgery up until this point had been pain. So the two primary methods used for preventing pain in surgery was alcohol and opium. So the problem with alcohol was that it sped up people's heart rates. So if you were operating on someone, you ran the risk of that person bleeding out on the table because their heart rate had been sped up. With opium, the dosages were very difficult to measure out. It was hard to get the right amount into people, so sometimes you could cause an overdose and cause them to die. There was also a weird Victorian attitude towards pain, that actually, in some ways, pain was a good thing, and that suffering, physical pain, was the right thing to go through, and that you should be tough enough to go through the pain and suffer the pain that you were experiencing. James Simpson was one of the key people in challenging this idea, and in the 1850s he discovered chloroform, which is a type of painkiller used to, or not a painkiller, an anesthetic used to put people to sleep when they were in surgery. So the picture that you'll see behind is James Simpson at a dinner party. This is the legend of how he discovered chloroform. He allegedly, at a dinner party, knocked over a bottle and of chloroform that he'd been using to experiment on, and then woke up 5 hours later and everyone in the room had been put to sleep by the chloroform. And all of a sudden, James Simpson had this great idea this could be used in surgery. However, surgery wasn't sorted by the 1850s. This discovery of anaesthetics and chloroform as an anaesthetic actually led to something called the Black Period, which is where deaths increased in surgery. That was because people were doing more invasive surgery. They were going deeper into people's bodies and for longer. And so actually, surgeons who weren't washing their hands, weren't washing their tools, weren't washing their clothes would go into surgery. And then because the patient was asleep, they could spend a lot of time operating on that person, going deep within their body. And the problem was that led to a lot more infection. And that's something that Joseph Lister, who is known as the father of modern surgery, sought to change. He learned about invisible germs by reading Louis Pasteur's work. You'll remember that Louis Pasteur's work was in 1861. He was building on Louis Pasteur's work and applied it to surgery. So he said, if germs cause illness, if I remove germs using an antiseptic, can I prevent illness? So he used a liquid called carbolic acid. He sprayed it on his hands, he sprayed it on the wound, and he sprayed it on the tools that he used. And what he proved was, by using an antiseptic, by trying to kill germs before surgery, you can prevent deaths. Now, this wasn't the end of the story of surgery, and he hadn't perfected it, as you'll see in the picture behind. Surgeons still wore a lot of outdoor clothing in surgery, so they hadn't fully understood yet, but it was a major step towards preventing germs in surgery and therefore keeping more people in operations alive. Finally, then, we've looked at some of the key people in medicine. We've looked at some of the key people in surgery. We're now going to look at the three key people, or three of the key people in public health. So the first one is John Snow. He was a surgeon born in 1813 and died in 1858 of a stroke. He was one of the first people to explain cholera. Cholera is a horrible disease spread by water that's mixed with feces. And London in the 1800s was incredibly dirty, lots of infections, lots of open sewers, rubbish, people living sometimes 10, 20 to one room in the apartment because of the Industrial Revolution. And John Snow, through identifying where people were dying, managed to prove that giving people dirty water or water that had mixed with feces would cause them to die. And that challenged the idea of miasma causing illness, and was one of the starting ideas behind people beginning to realise, if we make London cleaner for everyone, the public health, the health of the whole public, will improve. At a similar time, Edwin Chadwick, although not a medical doctor, he was working for the government, produced a report on the sanitary conditions of the labouring population. Now, again, this spread the idea that if areas are unclean, then people will get ill. Because previously, the popular idea had been that people in poor areas just get ill because they're poor, because they're stupid, because they can't look after themselves. And actually, Edwin Chadwick said, no, these areas have high death rates and people die very young in these areas because they are unclean. And within his report, he recommended people starting to remove refuse, so what would now be the equivalent of bin men, a sewage system in London, and medical officers. Now, this didn't lead to change immediately. It was just a report, but it was the start of the government understanding that actually they had a duty to look after all of the people in the country, and that people in poor areas didn't just die younger because of their own stupidity. Final person that we're going to look at in public health, and as I've said all throughout this isn't all of the individuals within the medicine course, but it's just to try and give you an overview and just make sure we're recapping, because the last time you would have studied these people is probably a while ago for some of you. Aneurin Bevan was the Welsh politician born in poverty who was at the forefront, one of the first people within the Labour government to push for the NHS, the National Health Service. So he was Health Minister for Labour in 1948 when free diagnosis and treatment for all was agreed. And the NHS was born. And obviously you will be seeing loads and loads about the NHS at the moment. What an amazing job they are, because they improve the whole of the public health because they are free to use. And that is not something that exists in every country. So where do these individuals fit in terms of factors? You will notice on your homework this third section about which factors are there an example of. So I'm just going to go through these quite quickly and just try and explain them to you. You might want to pause it and have a go at on your own first and then check my answers. Individual brilliance. So we've got Hippocrates, Galen. Communication, John of Ardern. John of Ardern wrote Practica in the 1300s. That's a very good example of communication. Anybody who wrote a book is a very good example of communication to share their ideas. Religion and superstition. Ibn Sina did his work because he was a devout Muslim. He was trying to please God by making the discoveries that he did in medicine. Vesalius, another example of a brilliant individual because he was challenging accepted views. He challenged the views of Galen. He went against what he was told to do. Paré, nice example of science and technology because he invented a number of different surgical tools to be used. Harvey, again, used metal rods in his experimentation to prove that blood circulates around the body one way. Teamwork, John Hunter was a big proponent of teaching the ideas that he discovered within surgery to others. He had his massive collection as well. Jenner, again, I explained when we were going through Jenner, but was a very good example of somebody who was working on their own against accepted practices by existing doctors. Chadwick worked for the government. His report was funded by the government. Pasteur was working and funded by the French government whilst his country was at war with Germany. James Simpson accidentally knocked a bottle of chloroform over, discovering it was chloroform. Lister discovered carbolic acid as a technology that could be used. Koch worked within a team. Particularly interesting is the fact that his assistant, a man called Petrie, whose surname was Petrie, invented the Petri dish. Fleming accidentally left the bacteria out, which was killed by the penicillin. Florey and Jane were working in a team at Oxford University together. Bevan was Labour Health Minister, so he was working for the government when he invented the NHS. He couldn't have just done it on his own. He needed the government funding in order to do that. So, pretty much over to you. You've got the question in front of you, or you should have it just here if you just want to have a look at it and write the answer on a piece of paper. I've given you some knowledge that you could use in the question. The key things are that you include a paragraph on religion, a paragraph on a different factor. You could do individual brilliance, you could do something else, and then a third factor. So you could do government and finance, you could do another one, and then overall in your conclusion why you think the factor that you've selected was most important. I'm not going to give you too much more explanation on this. The explanation is on the sheet. However, if you do have any questions, please feel free to email me. Best of luck. Thanks so much for your ongoing hard work, and hopefully see some of you very soon.